Shortland's graduation, Brady took on a few low-paying jobs as a butcher's assistant and an errand boy until January 1954. After that, he worked as an engine cleaner for British Railways, where his juvenile record led to his dismissal after a few days. There is no record of any further employment until the 6th of September of that year, which is when he began an apprenticeship at the Harland and Wolff shipyard on the River Clyde. Dar Sloane was delighted at the prospect of Ian becoming a tradesman, but the desire was not mutual. He had zero desire to work for anything other than making capital, and he said that the only jobs that piqued his interest during this time in his life were frequent burglaries in the Gorbals. On top of this, there is no way that the Sloane family could have known that Brady, if we are to believe his stories to the likes of Fred Harrison and Dr. Knightley, of course, was becoming increasingly disturbed with his green visions. His tumultuous inner self and his somewhat lackadaisical persona were diametrically opposed. Brady's luck soon ran out at the hands of another informer, and he appeared before Glasgow's Sheriff Court on the 29th of November, this time being convicted on 7 unique counts of housebreaking and theft-related offences. Myra and Dar Sloane admitted defeat. They'd done everything they could to reprimand him after his first 2 runnings with the law, but clearly nothing else was going to work with this lad. Brady, who had spent a brief period in St Vincent Street remand home, acknowledged that he might spend the foreseeable future in captivity. But to everybody's surprise, the court listened to the suggestion of his parole officer that he be placed on 2 years probation and serve no time, but only on the condition that he leave the confines of Glasgow to live with his real mother and her husband in Manchester. Naturally, Brady found this prospect unsettling, yet his options were limited. Ian took the train south to Manchester at the beginning of December, where Peggy welcomed him at Victoria Station, eager for a new beginning. He left Glasgow as Ian Sloane, although horse racing. They never worked together at 4 a.m. every morning. Ian was usually finished by noon and would spend his free hours lounging around cafes, drinking whiskey and beer in the local pubs, and betting his gambling pseudonym was Gorgon. Drink sometimes triggered what Brady would later dub the Black Light, although he claimed his first experiment this shortly before he finished at Shawlands, which involved him attacking a youth in a rival gang with a kosh. Again, there are no records of these instances, but essentially the term was coined in his eventual prison years. It was how Brady would nostalgically refer to the exhilaration he experienced during a violent act, specifically one that he was committing against somebody helpless, either by stature or through being outnumbered in a group. Power over fear simply meant outlasting the enemy by seconds or minutes, and when the danger passed, so did the black light. Conversely, if the will wilted under the threat of danger, then so did the black light. It wasn't that Brady was more prone to violent thoughts when he was drunk, but the black light was more visible through a clouded mind. It made his sadistic tendencies harder to hide, and he would get into multiple drunken brawls. However, it appeared that one aspect of this was that the second Brady sensed any sort of imminent threat from his opponent was the second he wilted. John Dean Potter commented based on his first-hand research, talking to Brady's former neighbours, friends and associates, that it would be in his character for Brady to attack someone, as long as he was part of a gang of 6 against 1. And that's the thing with bullies. They don't like doing it on their own, get a bully on their own, and they turn into a coward. That's the thing. Like, they like to have a gang with them to make them feel hard. Allegedly, Brady was also fond of telling people about his crimes in Glasgow. Potter also wrote that he was also fond of telling anyone who would listen of his life as a Glasgow tearaway, and how he and his 5 other schoolboys attacked a boy of 16 with knives. They ripped his shirt and slashed his chest, leaving him a bleeding hospital case in the street. When he retold the story, his eyes glistened and he became very excited, living it all over again. Brady also supposedly told a fictional story about how he murdered a child who informed him when he was a teenager, burying him on the bomb site in the Gorbals. It was an unusually warm day in the late 1955. The account Ian Brady later gave Dr. Knightley was that a Haworth's truck driver approached him while he was at the market on a routine, mundane mornings. The driver required assistance in loading over £44 worth of lead seals for sailor scrap. Brady, despite his suspicions about the theft, agreed to help and assisted him in lifting the large sack into the truck. When the driver arrived at the local scrap merchant, the dealer grew suspicious when he saw the sack's contents, making a note of the fact that Haworth's fruitiers was painted on the side of the truck. He contacted the police and the truck driver implicated Brady, so he tries to be a good person but then gets done. Brady assumed leniency and pleaded guilty, claiming to have been honest in his questioning. When he learned he would spend the next 3 months on remand in Strangeways Prison, Manchester, awaiting the next quarterly court sessions, he came to regret his choice. In the eyes of the authorities, Brady was no longer just a delinquent youngster who had gotten into trouble. He was now being treated as an adult, a convicted criminal awaiting sentencing. Brady believed it was completely illogical. He felt that he was only trying to be helpful, and yet he was the one sitting in the cell while the truck driver was getting ready to celebrate Christmas with his family. My natural relativism in strange ways, Brady immaturely proclaimed to Dr. Knightley in the 1990s. I said to myself that if they wanted me to be a criminal, I'd be a proper one. Many biographers have theorised that Brady's 3 months locked up in Strange fair trial. Psychiatrists have since claimed that by the age of 17, Ian Brady was a psychopath, according to one psychiatric report written many years later. He felt that this was a time of deep crisis in his life, and that in some way a decision had been made. He felt increasingly cut off from other people in the emotional sense. He could no longer feel concern for them or feel warmly towards them. He retained affection for his foster family. He found an affinity for literature of a sadistic nature and had sympathy with fascist ideology and Nazi practices. He says he was exhilarated by the loss of feeling as it appeared to be liberation or freedom, but at the same time he was distressed. A mid-20th century study of psychopathic criminals claimed that this group of people has caused doctors and lawyers more difficulties than any other class of offender. The 20th century psychiatrist David Henderson categorized psychopathic individuals in three ways: the aggressive, the inadequate, and the creative, and this categorization had been widely accepted in Britain by the mid-1950s. Whether these classifications still hold up today in a discussion for another time, but the first two categories can be respectively defined as those who are predominantly aggressive towards others or themselves, and those who are predominantly passive or inadequate, their aggressiveness being confined to mild threats to sulks, minor delinquencies, petty thieving and swindling. Additionally, the 1954 Postgraduate Medical Journal reported that establishing a secure relationship between a child and his mother by the age of 3 to 5 years is essential for normal development in a child. Though no psychiatric reports of Ian Brady from this prior period of his life have ever been made public, and for the most part we can only speculate as to what kinds of treatment he received if his psychopathic traits were recognised. At the very least, the categorisation of an inadequate psychopath could have been attributed to him given the nature of his petty offences and his mostly passive demeanour. In any case, postal staff and psychiatrists would never have guessed that somebody like Brady would eventually be capable of torturing, raping and murdering children. We do know, however, that Hatfield's psychological assessment deemed Brady unfit for the National Service. Brady faced severe discipline for producing and selling his own alcohol, which frequently led to his intoxication, and for operating a betting ring. On another occasion, he claimed to have gang-banged one of his informers in a dark field. Ian later claimed that he had accumulated many details of contacts during his time served, and that upon his release from Hull on the 14th of November 1957, he remained particularly close to a couple of his new friends, who he later said would go on to serve as accomplices alongside him in a spree of robberies. There is no evidence that this was true. By the time of his release, Brady had become remarkably well read. He said that he discovered the work of the Russian novelist Fyodor not long after his arrival at Hull, and would eventually go on to read all of his books several times over. He was particularly fond of the brothers Karamazov, but it is worth noting that Raskolnikov, the anti-protagonist of Crime and Punishment, took a particular hold on him. Admittedly, it is easy to see how, on a surface level, Brady may have identified with this character. Raskolnikov is a poor student living in St. Petersburg, all but completely isolated from everyone around him. In at the Hest Bank near Lancaster, even sending in tape recordings of German broadcasts for March to make into LP records. The letters were always written in overly large handwriting, starting with and ending with thank you. March assumed the writer was a schoolboy learning the language. Neighbours recalled him loudly playing these records from his gramophone. One neighbour, James Spilsbury, a war veteran, recalled that the marching songs were bad enough, but what really got to me was hearing the Nazi leaders screaming at their troops. I thought Brady must be a very peculiar chap, but he was always so quiet in the street. He rarely spoke to anyone and acted as though he was too good to live in the neighbourhood. Meanwhile, his next-door neighbour, an elderly gentleman named Charles Sharp, recalled, I used to see Brady often. He was very fond of his mother and was very reserved with her. He seemed more like a student than a working-class boy. He had a brainy manner, as if he were always thinking about something. I never saw any girls with him, but then his family never mixed with anyone. In late April 1958, Brady got a labouring job at Boddington's breweries. Aside from one brush with magistrates on June the 9th the same year for drunken and disorderly conduct, which resulted in a £1 fine, he managed to avoid getting into trouble. In October he faced another layoff, but departed with a positive reference. Unsurprisingly, Brady still had no real desire to work. He later told Alan Knightley that his idea of a decent job was that of a contract killer. It appears he went back to working at the market for a couple of months. In early February of 1959, he spotted an advertisement in the newspaper for a clerical job in the stock control of department at Millward's Merchandise Limited, a small chemical distribution plant at 11 Shulm Road Works in nearby Gorton. Having worked with various labouring jobs, both in and out of Borstal for years, and knowing he had no option but to work an actual job, Brady decided that a 9 to 5 in an office was the nearest option to no work at all. He looked back over his bookkeeping and accounting notes and sent off an application. A few days later, the manager, Tom Craig, called him for an interview. Following this, Craig offered him the job. Brady didn't make much of an impression during his early years in Millwoods. He wasn't the most punctual of people, although he was remembered as being a fairly decent worker when he put his mind to it. His colleagues were pleasant and sociable, but he would normally sit on his own at lunch, sometimes preferring to sit at his desk. His meals were repetitive. Sometimes he would eat egg and cheese sandwiches, and other times a meal consisting of cheese toast, raw eggs, and black tea. He was also known for his bad temper. One story goes that they even had to cancel regular bridge sessions because he would fly into fits of rage if his team lost. Craig put it best. He was so bad-tempered about anything that upset him. If you ticked him off about something, he would fly into a fit of rage. He had a shocking temper and his language was dreadful, but I used to pass it over just to keep peace. He was reasonable at his job, but he would have been was young people, children, just to keep in mind before we move on. I saw senior detectives and legendary crime reporters, hard men who had been through the war and seen terrible things, dissolve into tears. These words were how one former police officer described the experience of having to listen to a 16-minute long tape recording of the harrowing cries and pleas of a 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. She was the youngest victim of crimes that were eventually condemned to infamy as the Moors murders. The tape had been played at Chester Assizes Court on Tuesday, April the 26th, 1966. 6 months earlier, the hideous artifact had been found stowed away in one of the 2 suitcases in a left luggage office, alongside books on Nazism, violence, sadistic erotica, and distressingly 9 pornographic photos of the little girl. In the days preceding the discovery, her naked body had been carefully unearthed by police officers from a shallow grave on the moors. During that time, a couple in their 20s from a Hyde Council estate were being investigated in connection with the violent death of a 17-year-old boy named Edward Evans. Police had been considering their potential involvement in another child murders across neighbouring towns and cities that in the present day from the Greater Manchester area. The discovery of this evidence greatly strengthened the case against them, and by this time the preliminary hearings began before their eventual trial. The world's press had converged on Hyde. Soon the names Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were synonymous with pure evil. The mere mention of their most infamous moniker, the Moors murderers, bestowed upon them by the British press, conjures up images of their now notorious mugshots, glaringly haughtily down the barrel of the camels in stark monochrome. Even in the months, years, and eventually decades after they had been imprisoned for murder, Brady on 3 accounts, Hindley on 2, plus an additional accessory charge. Interest in the case never subsided. Every tabloid newspaper editor in Great Britain would have ears peeled for an opportunity for a salacious headline. Brady and Hindley were duly assigned plenty of other monikers too: the Devil's Disciples, the most evil couple in Britain, the Monsters of the Moors, Satan's Children, and countless more. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the case's enduring media sensationalism. The following are the most basic facts as of the year 2024. 61 years after their first murder and 59 years after their last, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were responsible for the abductions and murders of 5 children around Manchester, England in the 1960s. At least 4 of the children were essayed, and at least 3 had been buried in shallow graves on Saddleworth Moor, a vast stretch of moorland in the Dark Peak. Victims were Pauline Reed. I also apologise if I'm pronouncing these names wrong. I don't mean it in a disrespect way. I literally just don't know how to pronounce stuff. 16. John Kilbride, 12. Keith Bennett, 12. Leslie Ann Downey, 10. And Edward Evans, 17. What exactly drove Brady and Hindley to commit these crimes, however, remains a subject of debate, one that is often not even rooted in the truth, or sometimes even a shred of skepticism at all. Since Ian Brady was an unreliable narrator, his own detailed recollections of his youth should be regarded with skepticism, and there is little concrete information surrounding the true circumstances of his upbringing. What is known, however, is that he was born in Glasgow on January 1938 to a single mother who soon once they provided him with the care and love that he needed, his relationship with his birth mother was somewhat strained. After Brady and Hindley's eventual trial, one reporter remarked that Brady probably drew something sinister in the chromosomal lottery. Some modern commentators have theorized that the less than ideal circumstances surrounding the first few months of Brady's life may have been a traumatic effect upon his brain. Specifically, the parts that regulate bonding and emotional stability, sexual desire, the ability to identify the emotions of others, and the integration of emotion with perception. Brady admitted to animal cruelty as a child, although would later retract this and grow up a shy child with few friends. Supposedly, his documented fascination with the Nazis, horror fiction and true crime tales about gangsters began at a markedly early age. He claimed to have harboured resentment upon learning he was illegitimate at the age of 13, and his teenage years were marked by juvenile delinquency with multiple charges of housebreaking, theft and attempted theft to his name. After breaking his probation at 16 years old, he was ordered by the courts to move in with his birth mother, now living in Manchester, England with her new husband. At the age of 17, he was sentenced to 2 years in postal training, an old-fashioned form of juvenile detention, after being found guilty of being an accessory to robbery. After his release from Borstal, he worked a few menial jobs before eventually finding employment as a stock clerk for a chemical distribution firm called Millwoods Merchandise when he was 21 years old. Though on paper, to everybody around him, he seemed to have turned his life around. His fascination with violence and crime was growing, and he became increasingly disturbed by sadistic fantasies. In January 1961, 18-year-old Myra Hindley started working at the firm as a typist, and though he did not initially pay much attention to her, their mutual passion for poetry and literature altered everything by year's end. This would pave the way for a slow but steady entry into his world. July the 23rd, 1942, Myra Hindley was born to Nellie and Bob Hindley in Manchester. Bob was a paratrooper who did not return to Myra's life until after the war ended in 1945. Their home in Gorton, Manchester became a poisonous atmosphere after Nellie gave birth to her second daughter, Maureen, in 1946. This was largely due to Bob's alcohol addiction and his aggressive temperament, which was either instigated or aggravated following his return from the war. Myra's grandmother, Ellen Maybury, who lived on a nearby street, agreed to take her in so that her parents could focus on raising Maureen, and Myra would go on to live with Ellen up until the day of her eventual arrest. But Myra still saw her parents daily and ate every meal with her family. Myra had a difficult relationship with her father, who had exposed her to violence at a very early age through her watching him beat her mother. She also later alleged that both her mother and her father beat her, but she repeatedly contradicted details in her reiterations, and so can also be considered an unreliable narrator. Bob also encouraged Myra and Maureen to defend themselves from bullies with violence. At school, Myra was talented at physical education and English, but had a tendency to play truant and discovered that she could very easily manipulate her grandmother into writing sick notes for her. Hindley had a small but close circle of friends, one of whom was a boy named Michael Higgins. When Hindley was 14, Michael accidentally drowned in a reservoir, and she fell into a deep state of grief, blaming herself for not going along with him that day, as she felt she could have saved him somehow. Some of those close to her speculated that she was hysterical, and much later on in her life, a psychiatrist noticed that though she was not mentally ill in any way, she exhibited emotional lability, i.e. a tendency to shift rapidly and dramatically between different emotional states. Hindley committed herself to the Catholic modest upbringing, she seemed to look down on people anyway, and when she began dating Ian Brady, these characteristics became even more apparent, leading some to accuse her of being spoiled and a bit snobbish. Memories of Hindley during this time were not all bad, but her most lauded positive trait was that she was a good babysitter who had an exceptional way with the children, which in the context of the crimes that she was later committed of seems both unfathomable and yet highly disturbing, since she would eventually admit to abusing this quality to gain her victim's trust. Hindley claimed to have fallen in love with Brady on day one of meeting him in the office. She started writing in a diary halfway through the year, which detailed that she tried to pursue him for months before they eventually got together, even during the times when he was outright dismissive of her in the office. They first got together at the Christmas office party of 1961 and remained on casual terms for months before beginning a romantic relationship that soon became sexual. Hindley believed that Brady, despite his denials, was sexually inexperienced like herself, and remembered that their first efforts at intercourse were awkward and disjointed. They started to experiment by incorporating sadomasochistic pornography into sexual fantasies, which were strictly between themselves for the time being. Brady fancied himself an autocrat, and he was fond of the philosophical ideas of the Marquis de Sade. As far as he was concerned, people should be free to act on their base desires if they so desired, regardless of the consequences. It seems that Brady would eventually come to interpret Sade's work as a justification for his own paedophilia and his burgeoning desire to commit SA and murder. This eventually crossed over into his and Hindley's sex life, and they felt compelled by the idea of committing crimes. The couple initially discussed the prospect of robbery, and even though it was most definitely in a fantastical sense, he suggested that she acquire a shotgun and some rifles, something he was unable to do because of his juvenile record. They took many photos of themselves practicing with their guns around the Peak District, as if they were the British equivalent of Bonnie and Clyde. Hindley also received shooting instruction from a co-worker who served as president of a nearby rifle club. Nevertheless, he would subsequently attest that she feared a kick whenever she discharged a weapon and would shoot with both eyes closed. During this time, she was also taking driving lessons at Brady's urging, because he couldn't do this himself. Though they both enjoyed the freedoms this afforded them, it was largely in preparation for the abduction of their young victims. Saddleworth Moor, a moorland landscape situated on the outskirts of the modern-day Greater Manchester area, was Brady and Hindley's favourite spot to talk about their innermost desires. Though regeneration of the landscape has since taken place, at the time the landscape was scarce, brown in colour and foreboding, with its barbaric appearance attracting them. By June of 1963, the couple were living together at Hindley's grandmother's home. They frequently annoyed their neighbours by playing loud music such as Ravel's Bolero on purpose. At work, the couple were regarded as surly and unsociable by their colleagues. They would often giggle over pornographic books at their desk, and Hindley in particular would often be heard making explicitly racist and/or xenophobic remarks about various minorities. One time she mortified her co-workers when she walked into the office with an open book containing a picture of Holocaust victims in a mass grave, laughing and declaring, "Just look at this lot." Brady's and Hindley's respective accounts of their private life differ substantially. Hindley claimed that Brady regularly abused and raped her, and one friend had told police that early on in their relationship, Hindley had written her a letter claiming that she feared for her safety after suspecting that Brady had drugged and sexually violated her one evening. purposely set out to corrupt anyone. I believe the seed of corruption is already within all, requiring only the right primal incentive, circumstance, or utilitarian stimulus in which to blossom. Hindley, on the other hand, wrote in a 1976 parole play that she had confused love for infatuation when it came to Brady, and that she felt totally under his domination and worshipped him blindly. I believed him because I thought I loved him, and his arguments were so convincing. He demolished my tiny precepts with a single word. She did not admit her guilt over her involvement in their eventual crimes until 1986, and in the years following this admission she admitted to a therapist that I have to own the part that I have played in things, to accept that I wanted some of the things to happen. Despite police and victims' families suspecting differently, she would continue to insist that her role in the murders was subordinate to Brady's, and that she had never physically or sexually harmed a child. On the 12th of July 1963, 16-year-old Pauline Reed was walking to a dance in nearby Openshaw when she was approached by a woman in a black Ford Prefect van on Froxmore Street, Gorton. Pauline was friends with Maureen Hindley, so immediately she recognised Maureen's older sister as the driver of the van, though Myra Hindley claimed that she did not intentionally target Pauline and that she just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hindley asked Pauline if she would help her look for a lost glove on Saddleworth Moor, around a 30-minute drive from Gordon. Pauline accepted, and they were trailed by Ian Brady on his motorbike on the long drive to the moor. Brady and Hindley each gave different accounts of her murder, as they did with the other four murders, but what is certain is that Pauline was hit in the face and before having her throat cut twice. Her body was buried in a shallow grave around 150 yards away from the road. 12-year-old John Kilbride was Brady and Hindley's next victim. On Saturday the 23rd of November 1963, he was abducted from Ashton Market, Line, under the same pretences as Pauline Reed had been, that they were looking for a lost glove. It was cold, dark and foggy evening, and once they reached the moor and walked out of sight from the road, John was ambushed, essayed and then killed. His cause of death was never reliably ascertained. Hindley asserted that Brady informed her that he had strangled him using a ligature, while Brady asserted that he had strangled him manually. Because his body was buried in a shallow grave with a stream running through it, when his remains were eventually discovered 2 years later, they were so badly decomposed that his mother was forced to identify her son through solely his clothing, which is absolutely awful. I can't even imagine, what the fuck? You can't even identify them, only you know that that's a little boy's clothes. On Tuesday, the 16th of June 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett was walking to his grandmother's house in Longside, Manchester, the area where Brady's mother and stepfather lived, when he was approached by Myra Hindley in a white Morris minivan that she had recently purchased. Hindley claimed that Brady was in the back of the van, but Brady denied this and said Hindley picked him up a short while later before heading to the moor. What happened next is uncertain. Hindley claimed that, like with their two previous victims, she was not with Brady at the time of the S.A. Hall murder. This time she said she waited on her plateau with binoculars and she saw Keith disappear when Brady into a gully like a little lamb to the slaughter. She claimed to have neither carried easily nor seen or heard anything, despite the fact that her sound carried easily across the vast and empty moors. Brady allegedly returned sometime later carrying only a spade, and the couple's accounts of how Keith died were the same as their accounts of how John Kilbride had died. Tragically, despite repeated and widespread searches across the Saddleworth-Moor area, Keith's body was never found and is presumed lost. In September 1964, Brady, Hindley and Hindley's grandmother were relocated from their Gorton Council House to the new Hattersley-over-Spill development in Hyde, Cheshire. By that time, Maureen, now 18, had married her boyfriend, 16-year-old David Smith, and welcomed a daughter named Angela Dawn into the world. David himself was a former juvenile delinquent with a difficult upbringing and home life, and he had an extensive court history of housebreaking, theft and violence, much to the dismay of Myra and the rest of Maureen's family. Yet by all accounts, despite his and Maureen's relationship being tumultuous, to say the least, he was a natural and caring father to Angela. During this time, Brady bonded with David as Myra and Maureen also started to spend more time together, though neither Myra nor Brady particularly cared about the new baby. Though this annoyed David and Maureen, they saw nothing sinister about it at the time and ultimately attributed this to Brady being an eccentric introvert and Myra being concerned about how her younger sister might have been coping with motherhood at such a young age. On Saturday, the 26th of December 1964, Boxing Day in the UK, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey was abducted from a fairground in the Miles, Platting, Manchester. She was not brought directly to the moor this time, but was instead brought to Brady and Hindley's new house, 16 Wardle Brook Avenue, where her torture was captured on audio tape in the spare bedroom. Specifically, Brady and Hindley were trying to force a gag into Leslie's mouth and undress her, and the tape, as previously mentioned, ran on for 16 minutes as the little girl frantically begged for her mother. The recording apparently ended so that Brady could plug in his photography light, and he then took multiple pornographic photos of the child. Hindley claimed that after the tape had ended, she went into the bathroom to run a bath for Leslie, and when she came back in, Leslie was lying deceased on the bed with an injury to her neck and other injuries that indicated that she'd been raped. Years later, Brady contested this version of events and claimed that Hindley strangled Leslie with a silk cord, though Leslie's autopsy had already proven this story to be blatantly false. Strangulation by ligature was excluded, and there was no clear injury to Leslie's neck either, and like John Kilbride, her cause of death remains unknown to this day. On the 25th of April 1965, David Smith, now 17 years old, went to work as Maureen stayed home to look after 6-month-old Angela Dawn. At one point in the day, she went upstairs to check on a sleeping baby and found that Angela wasn't breathing. Maureen wasted no time in rushing Angela to the hospital, but sadly no amount of care or attention could save her. Her untimely death was eventually determined to have been caused by bronchitis. David in particular was plunged into a deep state of grief, and he and Maureen sought consolation in Myra and Brady. The group often went to Saddleworth-Moor together, where David and Maureen unknowingly sat on top of the graves of other deceased children, presumably to the amusement of Brady and Myra. David became increasingly skeptical about the existence of a god, and Brady took this opportunity in stride. He started to encourage David to read the same pornographic literature he had already introduced to Myra. It needs to be noted that Brady was a whole decade older than his new friend, and looking back years later, David would come to see that he was a victim of attempted grooming by Brady, though that word meant nothing to him at the time, as it was an alien concept in the 1960s. The two would often drink in the living room whilst Myra spent time with Maureen, and Brady used this as an opportunity to discuss the prospects of robbery and murder with David. He naively went along with this, as he didn't trust that Brady was in any way serious about it. As the prosecution's lead witness in the trial that took place months later, David told the court that one evening, in around September of 1965, they had been drinking for 4 or 5 hours when Brady asked him what he would do if he had to shoot someone during a robbery, and would he consider using marked bullets. I thought it she was doing the talking. He went on to say that he had killed 3 or 4 people. This just convinced me that it was a beer talking. He leaned back and he said, "You don't really believe me?" I must have smiled at him. Getting a bit tired I was, and then he said it will be done. And a matter of a quarter of an hour later, we were both asleep. On a different occasion, Brady had told David that his victims were buried on the moors and that he had pornographic evidence of his crimes. David didn't believe him and believed it was the alcohol talking again. Brady also discussed with him how he prepared for each murder, with David explaining to the court that all his clothes would be brushed and cleaned and inspected. Everything would be listed that he had on, and he said he took a drug, Pro Plus, as a stimulant. David was convinced that Brady was leading up to committing a robbery and later admitted that on Tuesday the 5th of October, he gave the books pornography he had been reading back to Brady in order to clear his home of any incriminating material. Brady and Myra put them in suitcases and David watched as he ran. They then drove off with them in Myra's car. It was later revealed that they had deposited them in the left luggage office of Manchester Central Railway Station. Myra woke David and Maureen up the following evening by pressing the buzzer to their flat. When she came upstairs, she and Maureen had a brief conversation before Myra asked David if she could walk her back home. David agreed, and when they reached the house, Brady called in David to ask him if he wanted to collect some miniature alcohol bottles from the kitchen. He then left David in there, and seconds later, David heard a couple of ear-piercing screams. He ran into the living room to see Brady hitting a young man around the head and neck with a hatchet. The young man in question was 17-year-old Edward Evans from Ardwick, Manchester. He was approached at Manchester Central Railway Station by Brady and asked if he would like to come back to his house for drinks, and claimed to have introduced Myra as his sister when he reached the car. Brady claimed that Edwards was a familiar face to him from Manchester's gay scene, but it is unknown as to whether this was the truth or whether Brady was deliberately alleging that Edward was a homosexual in order to paint his victim in a damaging light and deflect some of the accountability from himself onto Edward. As a result of the careless repetition of Brady's claims in the press, Edward's family endured enormous suffering in 1960s Britain, when homosexuality was still regarded as both a crime and a perversion. Furthermore, forensics and the police were unable to ascertain if Brady or Myra had engaged in any form of sexual activity with Edward that night before David Smith showed there, whether it had been consenting or not. One lesser reported detail of this murder is that an affectionate letter from a female friend of Edward's was found by police upon his deceased body, though both the identity and the nature of her relationship with Edward is unknown, stained in blood. Of his attacking of Edward with the hatchet, Brady would later maintain that it should have taken only one hit to kill him, meaning that the intent was for David to run into the room, see the bloodied corpse on the floor, and then immediately react to it. Instead, it took 14 clumsy hits, and David ended up watching the gruesome murder in its near entirety as he stood in shock in the doorway. Edward was still not deceased after this, so Brady proceeded to strangle him with an electric cord in order to accelerate his death, likely to minimise the risk of either a neighbour hearing or Myra's grandmother, who was upstairs asleep in bed. Inevitably, she woke up to the noise, but Myra reassured her that Brady had just dropped the tape recorder on his foot, and so she went back to sleep none the wiser. Throughout the murder, Myra stood watching Brady attack Edward, even though she later claimed that she was in the kitchen with her hands over her ears during the ordeal. This was not only contested by David Smith and later Brady in the years after he had confessed in 1985, but forensic evidence also confirmed this due to arterial blood splurts on the outside of her shoes, meaning that not only was she in the room, but she was stood close to Edward. David had to force himself to think straight in the aftermath of the horror, fearing that if he did not comply, Brady and Myra would kill him next. He insisted the couple with cleaning up the house, tying up Edward's body and moving it into the spare room so that they could bury him on the moor with the other 4 children the next day. Leslie Ann Downey and John Gilbride from Lutterworth Moor. Brady had initially admitted to hitting Edward with the hatchet, but claimed that he did it in self-defence during a confrontation and said that David Smith was the one to strangle him afterwards. He absolved Hindley of all accountability, but denied all knowledge of the murder of John Gilbride, despite Brady having taken a photograph of Hindley and her dog, Puppet, standing directly above the shallow grave and looking down. Regarding the murder of Leslie Ann Downey, they claimed that Brady had agreed to photograph the child for David Smith, but had assumed that he was bringing them a girl much older than 10 years old, and that their behaviour, as shown in the tape, was merely them trying to placate her. They claimed that afterwards David removed her from their home, with Brady explaining that after completion we all got dressed and went downstairs. Little did he know that his blunderous choice of phrasing would hint at both his and Hindley's involvement in S.A.ing Leslie. On the 6th of May 1966, Brady was found guilty of the murders of Edward Evans, Leslie Ann Downey and John Gilbride, and handed 3 life sentences. Hindley was handed 2 life sentences after being convicted of the murders of Edward and Leslie, plus an additional 7 years for harbouring, assisting and maintaining Brady, knowing that he had killed John Gilbride. The trial judge, Justice Fenton Atkinson, described the couple in his closing remarks as 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity, and made a point that he was passing the only sentences that the law now allowed, referencing the fact that the death penalty had been outlawed only months before the trial. British public were outraged not only by the unspeakable sadism of Brady and Hindley's crimes, but also the fact that they did not receive the death penalty. However, at this time, the families of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett were still left without answers as to what had happened to their missing relatives. Pauline's mother, Joan Reed, recalled, "I never thought that Myra Hindley and Ian Brady was to do with it all until their arrest, because her sister wasn't near neighbour, lived next door but one, Maureen. She went missing there. Myra Hindley was talking to me normally and saying she was sorry about Pauline. Knowing she'd done that, I didn't think till after it all came back to me what was what." Hindley notably spent the rest of her life campaigning for parole. After 6.5 years of corresponding behind bars, she broke up with Brady in 1972 and rediscovered her Catholicism. She maintained that she knew nothing of any of the murders, but directly implicated Brady in them, which left him feeling betrayed by her. Brady publicly admitted his involvement in the killings for the first time in 1985 to the journalist Fred Harrison. This was an effort to keep Hindley behind bars for good, but when police reopened their investigation into the case after the resulting Sunday People articles, Brady was scornful of any suggestion that he had confessed to more murders, and clearly mentally unwell. He was diagnosed with acute paranoia and schizophrenia later that year, and was transferred to a psychiatric hospital. Despite this, the police decided to continue searching Saddleworth Moor. On Thursday, the 31st of October 1986, Winnie Johnson, the bereaved mother of Keith Bennett, wrote a letter to Myra Hindley in a direct appeal for her to tell her where her son is buried and what had happened to him. She wrote, "As a woman, I'm sure you can envisage the nightmare I've lived with day and night, 24 hours a day since then, not knowing whether my son is alive or dead, whether he ran away or was taken away is literally a living hell, something which you no doubt have experienced during your many, many years locked in prison. Please, I beg of you, tell me what happened to Keith. My heart tells me you know, and I am on bended knees begging you to end this torture and finally put my mind at rest," which is just so heartbreaking because you can just literally hear how like she's at like her wit's end, like she's just sort of like a last resort, like she's just so helpless and she's just bleeding because she just wants to know where her little boy is buried. According staff member at Wood Prison. Hindley appeared genuinely moved by the letter, but then firmly declared, "I wish I did know something I could at least then put the poor woman out of her misery." Police visited Hindley, and although she refused to admit any involvement in the killings, she agreed to help by looking at photographs and maps to try to identify spots that she had visited with Brady. After weeks of cooperation with police, including a visit to Saddleworth Moor, in an unsuccessful attempt to allegedly trigger memories, Hindley made a formal confession to her involvement with the murders in February 1987. She admitted to abducting the children and harbouring Brady in the knowledge that he'd SA'd and murdered them, although she was positively reinforced by both police and her own counsel. Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping and his team ultimately felt that they had witnessed a great performance rather than a genuine confession. Based on Hindley's account of the murder of Pauline Reed, police were able to narrow down their search focus on the moor, and her body was finally recovered on Wednesday, the 1st of July 1987. 2 days later, police took Ian Brady to visit the moor in the hopes he had any information that would result in the discovery of Keith Bennett's body, but these efforts were unsuccessful as Brady appeared confused and disillusioned on the day. The search would eventually be called off in August after police felt they had exhausted every possible lead. Hindley died in prison in 2002 and Brady died in a high-security hospital in 2017, both of natural causes due to prolonged health complications. The BBC reported on Wednesday, the 1st of July 2009, that Greater Manchester Police had officially given up the search for Keith Bennett, saying that only a major scientific breakthrough or fresh evidence would see the hunt for his body restart, which is just so heartbreaking because they found the others, but they just haven't found him, and it's just so heartbreaking. Like, obviously they want to find all of them, and the fact that this poor child is out there and like can't be properly put to rest, it's just so heartbreaking for the family, and knowing that as well and having to go through that again, and it's just awful. At around 11:25 a.m. on Thursday, the 29th of September 2022, Greater Manchester Police was contacted by the representative of an author who had been researching Moore's murders case, claiming that suspected human remains had been found on Saddleworth Moor. This proved to be a false alarm, and it has since been alleged by Alan Bennett, Keith Bennett's brother, that this was nothing more than an attempted promotional stunt to assign some credibility to the author in question. The suspected human remains were confirmed to be plant material. And that's all I have on this case. It's just such a crazy and awful case, honestly. It's like such a difficult one. Obviously all the cases are difficult, but like some of them just so awful. Anyway, thank you guys for watching as always, and I'll see you